Library Board President and longtime library advocate and friend, Lowell Liedman. You may
Thank you ever so much, Chris, and it's truly my honor to introduce two extraordinary people. I'm going to start. I'm going to start with the poet. We have a poet here, and we have a writer of prose and a publisher. But we're going to start with Richard first. Richard taught at Ulm High School for quite a few years. I'm not asking him how many. And then he
14.
And then he taught at Mankato East for
18.
18. Okay. During Richard's first year here, I was not teaching at the high school. I was on a leave of absence. And I came back the summer before school started, and several people told me, what a wonderful addition. Such a smart guy and such a good speaker. And he turned out to be exactly those things, of course. I remember overhearing some students in the hallway. I didn't ask them anything. I just overheard students, like when they were changing classes. And I remember one student saying, I just can't sleep in Mr. Meyer's class. And then another guy said, it's probably because he's so loud, right? They were actually very complimentary.
I heard that a lot in my career, yeah.
And then when the English staff was in the annex, the little building between the high school and Jefferson, I also heard from some other students who said, I'm not in Mr. Meyer's class, but I can hear him better than I can hear the teacher in my class. And he was wondering, can I get credit for 2 different English classes at the same time?
They could audit me. The same thing happened in Mankato, actually. And there wasn't an open area, but on the second floor, the geometry teacher would often tell her students to, let's quit geometry, just listen down the stairwell and you can hear Meyer.
And I had Amy in class a long time ago, and Richard and I had a special connection with Amy and some other students also in an academic decathlon group that no longer exists, unfortunately. I'm going to embarrass you, Amy, by telling everybody that of all the probably thousands of students I had over the years, you were the most extraordinary student. Smartest, maybe. The most productive, maybe. But if you look at everything, just terrific. And Amy wound up going to Harvard. During my time in Ulm, we've had 2 students go to Harvard, and they both went the same year, which was amazing. And after graduating from Harvard, she went to prestigious Washington University in St. Louis. And there, simultaneously, she earned an MD and a PhD. Who does that? Who ever does that? So, if I've embarrassed you, that was my purpose. The program tonight is going to be a little different than some author talks because, well, just watch and see what happens.
Thank you, Lowell.
Thank you so much.
You want to start? Yeah. I know what I forgot to ask you before we
Yes.
start here is, do we want to invite questions at any time during our presentation or
Sure.
wait to the end?
Anytime. Except right now.
Yeah.
Not right now.
Not right
Anytime
this
after
instant, right.
right now.
I enjoy keeping these things conversational and informal. So, I mean, as we get going here, feel absolutely free to ask a question, make a comment, and you don't even have to raise your hand if you don't want to. You just speak up.
But you'll have to speak louder than Richard in order to be heard. So. Right. So we're just going to have a conversation.
Right.
So, should we start?
We'll start. Want me to start?
Yeah.
As you've heard, I write poetry and Amy writes prose, science, action, thriller novels, which is a genre separate from science fiction, which a lot of people enjoy when you think of Star Wars and all that kind of thing. Her books are grounded in much more fact and reality. And so I'd like to ask Amy a question to start with, and that's how you got involved in writing.
It's through the science, primarily, yeah. So I got started writing, actually the first writing I ever did was in middle school, like writing like not for school and whatnot, because we got Reader's Digest at home, and there are little columns in there. You remember these little things? They'll give you $25 if you send in a joke or a story or an anecdote. And I really wanted that, both the $25 and to get my little thing in Reader's Digest. And so I would send things in, and they never were accepted. Part of the problem was that I actually didn't have any jokes, and I didn't have any anecdotes to share because I was like 10. So, and that target audience for that magazine is a little bit older. So that didn't go anywhere. But then when I was in college, I took a required freshman expository writing course, which we can come back to that. But I had an idea for a novel, which is probably true of about 90% of people on Earth. They have an idea for a novel. Ideas are relatively cheap to come by. It's turning it into a story and then actually executing the story that's the hard part. But I had that idea, and it was a science-based idea about what if you had a virus that could be used to kill particular people, to target particular people. And that germ of an idea was what I wrote a book about. And I did that in 1995. And the reason it was that year is I had just finished part of my medical school, and I was entering the research part of my training. So I was in the lab, and I actually had a lot of flexibility and a lot of free time. And my husband was a medical intern. It was his intern year. So he was working like 80 to 100 hours a week, and I was working like 40. So I sat down and thought, what am I going to do with my free time? I mean, God forbid I like socialize or something. So I sat down and wrote this terrible book. But I was reasonably proud of myself just for having done it. And of course, I thought it was better than it was. Everyone does with their first baby. But that was sort of the end of the story at that point. And then life continued to happen, and I had children, and I finished school, and we moved to California. And it was when I was teaching at California State University that idea was still sticking with me. I was teaching microbiology at that point, so I was starting to have more ideas about crazy things related to microorganisms and that would make good stories. So I revisited that idea, and I wrote another book. And that book was called The Han Agent. And it was definitely better than the other. And along the way also, I got involved in writing community and was going to writing conferences and studying craft and whatnot. So it didn't just fall out of the sky. And that book was reasonably good. And I did have a New York literary agent represent it, but we failed to sell the book. So I put it away and went on to write Petroplague, which most of you know is my first book. And so Petroplague and then Reversion came a few years later, but the idea of the Han Agent was my original idea from the 1990s, and so I revisited the second manuscript, thinking I could fix it up and self-publish it or something at this point, and I was just completely dissatisfied with it. I thought it was not salvageable, and so I had started the story again. So the third time, I took that idea and wrote an entirely new book on that and called it The Han Agent, which is actually my new release that's coming out September 5th. So that original idea has finally seen the light of day. So that's been the path, sort of one step at a time. I never envisioned myself as being a novelist or doing this sort of thing, but you know how it is with life. You take one step and you find out that it's working and you enjoy it and you just keep going. And so here we are.
When Lowell was introducing Amy, he gave that long list of her many talents, and she is. I mean, this is not brag, it's just plain fact, a multi-talented person. And writing is one of those skills of hers. One thing we didn't mention is, this will come up as we go along, is that in addition to her science background, university professor, writer, journalist, she's also a publisher. She started her own publishing company. And I think I'm going to do this now.
Oh, go for it.
When Amy graduated, went off to Harvard, and this was certainly for me, and even I think initially Amy's first year or so, these were pre-computer days.
Yes.
And so we corresponded with handwritten letters, and these are some of the letters that Amy sent me from Harvard. And I have even copies of the letters that I wrote back to her. And I was looking through these when I knew Amy was going to be visiting, and I found something. It's a couple brief passages that I'm going to share with you because it's extraordinarily telling about Amy and our long connection and what has happened in all these intervening years. Because after when she was out of Harvard, we still communicated, but then as sometimes happened, lives kind of go in different directions, and we sort of lost contact for a while.
Quite a while.
Well, this letter from Amy to me is dated March 10th, 1988. And she wrote it from Harvard, and here are just a couple of sentences I want to read. Amy wrote this: I have organic chemistry, German, calculus, and expository writing this term. Expos, as it is called, that's the writing class, is an interesting writing class required of all freshmen. I was inspired while writing my last paper and came up with something I was quite pleased with. My prof loved it, too, and told me I had a natural talent for writing. And of course, she's going to Harvard but the biological sciences. That's the degree she's pursuing. I'm sending you a copy for the heck of it. The assignment was to write about the author of a short story we had read by imagining, without any facts necessary, what the author was like. And so Amy sent me a copy in the same letter of that essay she wrote for her Harvard prof, who loved it. And here's what I wrote back later that same month in 1988. Thank you for sending me a copy of the paper you wrote for your composition class. It's an exquisite piece of writing, Amy, purely exquisite. Your sentences are a joy to read. And then a few lines later I say this: there are few things I admire and enjoy more than excellent writing, and your essay is certainly that. Although science is your first love among the academic disciplines, you may yet yield to the magnetic tug of the liberal arts and become a literature and humanities major. And then...
Right on the idea, wrong on the timing.
And then here's the coup de grace. Page or two later in my letter, I say this. I wrote this: along with this letter, I'm including a few poems from my never-to-be-published collection. I used to send her some of the poems I had written in those days. And I had never sent anything out for publication yet. I just wrote for friends and fun. From my never-to-be-published collection. After reading your manuscript composition, I rather dread sending you any more of my creative writing attempts. And 27 years later, after I had written that sentence, Amy published my book of poetry, Orbital Paths.
Yeah.
I found that a most interesting cycle of things in time.
Yeah. Your award-winning book of poetry, Orbital Paths. So yeah, I can't believe you have those letters, and that is so good. Oh, thank you.
Could I ask?
Yeah, of course.
What led you to be a publisher? And what else have you published, or how does that work in your life?
Right. So the world of publishing is changing dramatically, has changed completely in the last few years, in the sense that publishing your own work used to be virtually impossible, or at the very least extremely costly. And you also had no way to sell your books if you self-published. But because of changes in printing technology and in computers and a variety of things, it's now become quite feasible for people to self-publish in a variety of ways. So a lot of people are doing it. A lot of people are throwing up books on Amazon as Kindle ebooks and just doing that. But I wanted to go the traditional route with my first book, and that didn't work. And then with my second book, I had a traditional publisher that bought just the ebook rights only. And so I still had the rights to the print book, and this is Petroplate. And I wanted a print version. So I said, well, I'll just do the print version myself. And so at that time, I didn't know what I was doing. And so, I got this book. But I liked the process because I do like just learning different things and trying stuff out, and I like control. And so with reversion, I decided I would just do it myself, but that I would get serious about this publishing thing and figure out how it's done, figure out how to do book layouts, figure out how to work with all of the behind-the-scenes stuff that goes on computing-wise to get a book into the marketplace. And so I learned all that, and it was a pretty significant commitment of time and effort to do that. And I did. And then I sat there and I thought, well, I've just invested, how many 100 hours into this, and I produced one book every 3 years. And not only will I have completely forgotten all of this in 3 years, but this is sort of a waste. So I actually had access to manuscripts because I also run a website called sciencethrillers.com, which is a book review website that I've been running for about 7 years now. And people send me books to review. And usually they're self-published books or books that they haven't even published yet, but they're about to release and whatnot. And so I thought, well, I could probably find someone who would let me help them publish their work. And that's exactly what I did. I had a book that was sent to me for review. It was an ebook only edition. And I absolutely loved this book. It was called The Neanderthal's Aunt. And it's basically a chick lit book of it's a lab-lit chick-lit book. It's a humorous romance satire about this young woman scientist in New York whose sister is a socialite, a widowed socialite, who tells her that she's going to become the mother of a Neanderthal baby. And it's very funny and very smart and very sassy, and I loved it. And so I approached the author and said, I see that you've published this book, I love it, but I see that you don't have a print edition. How would you like to be, the first book published by Science Thrillers Media? And she's like, well, okay, sure. So I edited the book with her to make it, because it had a few weaknesses, and that was the first book that I published. And set up a website, and then I started getting submissions. So Science Thrillers Media has published 3 novels by people not me, the poetry book, and a couple of children's science picture books. And depending on the book, either in both digital and print, or one or the other. And of course, I do my own books now as well. And that is really a fun thing to do. I enjoy that. Thanks for asking.
There's a good chance my book would not have been published without Amy. I mentioned that I hadn't sent. I've been writing most of my life since a late teenager, and never bothered to send anything out. It's only about 6 or 7 years ago that I began sending out some poems for publication. And I was fortunate. I had like 45 or 50 poems in a 4-year period, accepted by some pretty major journals, literary magazines, both print and online. Won a couple really nice awards, one including the Robert Frost Award, which got me some national attention. I was referred to as a emerging poet. And that pleased me to no end because, given my age, I'm glad to have emerged before being interred. But even with that, it's difficult to get. And Amy's comment about publishing and other poets that I know that I've met from New York and other states and even overseas, who've been in the game a lot longer, have told me how that's changed. Many of the big publishing houses don't publish poetry anymore. First of all, there's no money in it at all.
No money in it.
The general reading public doesn't generally read poetry, which is kind of a shame, I think. It wasn't always that way. And so many of the big publishing houses maybe only have a few selected authors that they know will sell, and like Mary Oliver and some such writers. Otherwise, they don't do it. But I did read, too, that there are over 2,000 poetry books a year published. But they're published by university presses, small college presses, independent publishers, like Amy and others. And I did come this close several times. I had a couple of Minnesota publishers write me and said they really liked my book. It was even a personal letter, not just a generic email saying, forget it, Buster. And they liked the manuscript, but they were already 3 years out, that particular publishing company, and they already had their fiction, nonfiction, and poetry books lined up for the next 3 years to publish. And so then I decided, well, maybe I'll never have a book published, or sometime down the road, maybe I'll find out a way to publish it myself. And that's when
and that's right about then. So we had fallen out of touch for quite a while, but you were active on Facebook.
Right.
And I think it was either through Facebook or maybe even the New Ulm Journal. Somewhere there was something about the Robert Frost Prize, and I realized that you were still out there, that you were very active as a poet, and that you were writing something good. And we reestablished contact through Facebook. And I think basically I loved your work. I have to confess, actually so I knew that you'd won the prize, and I said I was in the stage of getting my company started, and I said that if you failed to find a publisher for your book, that I would do it. And that was partly selfish because I needed to practice, right? So you were sort of one of my test cases. But when you agreed to do that, or decided to do that, I was a little bit nervous because I'd only seen a little bit of your work, and I was afraid it might be awful, or that at least I wouldn't like it. But you sent me the manuscript, and I read it on a plane one time, and the whole thing, and I was so happy because it was so beautiful, and I just was so excited to be a part of putting it together. So I think we did a really good job. It's a beautiful book. It's a beautiful book, and the poetry is laid out on the page in ways that I think might not have happened if you had gone with a publisher who didn't care.
That's the other thing, working with Amy, is that, and I remember that exchange of emails, because when I sent her the manuscript, I said, I'd be glad to take you up on that offer of publishing. But then I had all sorts of caveats. I said, you have to like it, and if there's anything that you professionally or personally don't like, that doesn't sit well with you, feel free to say, I'll pass. But we were very compatible, and it worked out well. For a poetry book, this is a big book. Most poetry books by a single author, they might be 45 pages, 60 pages. They're quite slim. This is 170-some pages. One of the people who sort of reviewed it and gave a blurb said it's about 3 times the size of a typical poetry book. And if I had been with any other publisher, I would not have had any say in the cover design. I wouldn't have had a total control over what went in here for poems or the arrangement of poems. I know fellow poets who, when they get a book contract, they have to go with what the publisher and editor desires. If they say this is what the cover is going to be, you take it and live with it. If they say, I don't really like these particular poems in the book, take them out, you have to do it. But it wasn't that way with Amy. It was, you tell me what you want, and she had great input, though. She found a few typos that I had missed, and suggested some rearrangements of some poems in the different sections of the book, and so I couldn't have had a better publisher to put the book out.
So I got my practice. I had my the big challenge was turning that into an ebook, because program, if you're doing ebooks, normally are just what they call reflowable. Just if you've read a book on a Kindle or something, the text changes depending on how big of your screen is or how big you want the type to be, which is fine if it's just a novel with just text flowing. But if you have a poem with a certain layout on the page, it becomes a technical challenge.
We did it. You did it.
Yeah, got it done. So
I'm a techno idiot. I would have been lost without Amy on this.
So what else have we got?
Well, I know I was going to ask you one thing about your novels, and that is, do you have more fun creating the heroes of your book or the villains?
I have most fun creating the microbes.
The microbes, of course.
So on the way to learning how to write a book, one of the big mistakes, here's a story. So again, this idea for the Han agent that I turned around and used so many times. At one point in that process, I had this great idea. There was this team of people from the CDC, and there was this virus out there, and it was great. And I went to a writer's conference, and the book wasn't even done. It was only about halfway done. And there was a big New York literary agent at this conference at a cocktail reception. There were a bunch of people around him talking and asking questions. And so I came up to listen, because I was there to listen and learn. And as I was standing there, the crowd sort of finished their conversation and drifted away until it was just me and him standing there. And he looked at me and did what he's supposed to do at these events. He was polite, and he said, "So, what do you write?" And I stammered something about what I was working on, and he kind of patiently looked at me and said, "Okay, so tell me about your protagonist." And I'm like, I wonder what that means. And I think I know what that means. and I don't have one. I have a virus, though. Yeah, okay. I don't really have a main character, but I've got a virus. Does that count? And then so after that, that was one of the aha moments in my writing career, and I realized I have a lot to learn about this storytelling business. So I still get excited about the germs first, yeah, and plot. Although I'm starting to get better now about getting excited about character first, because I find that is a problem if you start with plot and just go with plot. Then you have to do a lot of rewrites to make the characters happen. It's better if you have a good idea ahead.
And because you write action thrillers, the science has to be there and able for the reader to understand, but the story just has to be plain good too, doesn't it?
It has to be good,
Yeah.
and my goal is always to make it, well, any thriller writer tries to make it believable, but if any of you read thriller fiction, you know that sometimes they go a little bit beyond believable, but sometimes you can just roll with it. And the thing that defines the science thriller genre, as I define it, is that these are stories that are set in the real world with real science at the heart. Science, though, that somewhere along the way becomes fiction, but you probably can't tell it became fiction, and that's what I'm striving for in all of my books. In all of my books, I think what makes them unique is that there's always a moment in the story where the plot turns on the result of an experiment, and that's like important to me, and I'm always going to try to have that somewhere. Somebody does an experiment, and the answer from that matters.
Could I ask, I read Petro Plague.
Yes.
And as I was reading it, I could not tell where, the real stuff stopped.
Right.
I was just believing it all.
Yeah. Good.
But it's awful. I mean, if
Yeah.
that's believable and possible, that's awful. So is it possible?
Well, it's just this side of not possible, right? Because these bacteria that break down gasoline, they're called hydrocarbonoclastic bacteria. They break down hydrocarbons for food. They exist. And actually, I had the idea for the book and was writing it, and I was actually wondering myself, why don't these bacteria get into the gasoline and destroy it? And I think the answer is a little bit non-technical in a way. I think it's the same reason that that your sugar jar doesn't spoil, right? Sugar is the perfect food for really every living thing. There really aren't any living things or very few living things that cannot consume glucose, or table sugar isn't glucose, but still, it's a very good food source. Why doesn't it get moldy, right? Everything else gets moldy. That's the same reason. The answer to that is probably the same answer why these bacteria that eat gasoline don't grow in gasoline. And it has to do with the fact that you need more than food, that one particular energy source, to survive. Okay, most microorganisms need access to water, and they need access essentially to fertilizer, micronutrients like phosphorus and nitrogen, and they're not going to get that in gasoline, and they're not going to get it in a bowl of sugar. So no water, no phosphorus, no nitrogen, nothing's going to necessarily grow there, even though it's very rich in energy. It's very rich in energy. So yeah, these bacteria do exist. They are actually useful in cases where there are oil spills. They sometimes will spray bacteria onto those oil spills to help break down the hydrocarbons into something harmless. And after the Deepwater Horizon spill down in the Gulf of Mexico a few years back, all of that crude oil spilled into the Gulf. The heavy components that show up as tar on beaches and everything, even the microbes won't touch that, or they consume it very, very slowly. But all of the lighter stuff, the methane and the good parts of the liquid gasoline that was coming out of the earth, disappeared from the Gulf very quickly, much quicker than anyone expected, because those bacteria are naturally present in the Gulf of Mexico all the time. There's always petroleum seeping naturally in the Gulf, and so those populations of bacteria exist. And when that thing started gushing, it's like, hey, and those bacteria proliferated into huge numbers, and they ate it all. So all of that is sort of floating around in my mind, right, when I'm creating this story. Well, what if they actually did eat the gasoline? And in my book they do. But I did put in some genetic twists to make it even more believable, even if you know, well, they don't normally, because the ones that I've been describing, they all need oxygen to do what they do. So if you have gasoline in an underground tank that's leaking underground, these bacteria aren't going to help you much because there's not enough air. They do work very well in the presence of oxygen. So in petroplague, there's a genetic switch that's made, and they become the ones that grow in the absence of oxygen become able to grow in the presence of oxygen. But hopefully you don't need to know or understand any of that, right, to read the book and enjoy it.
Do you still do any research from your other degrees?
Other than my refrigerator, which I've been accused of showing some experiments in there, no, I have not. I actually haven't worked in a lab for a long time, because when I taught at California State University, it was just a teaching job only.
One of the things that Amy liked when she read my manuscript is that a number of the poems in my book, in some way or another, are science related. For years, I've had an interest in astronomy as a layman, and a little bit of geology and anthropology. And so a number of my poems, not anywhere near in expertise, the kind of science Amy does, but I've been fascinated. Well, one of my favorite astronomers was Carl Sagan, and I loved his book, Cosmos, because he had a way, which I find a parallel to Amy, is to take that science stuff and put it in a fiction form so that a layman reader can kind of understand it, and then have the characters or the narration presented in a way where the reader is carried along is quite a skill to do. It's not like being in Harvard listening to the chem prof lecture, because I'd be totally lost. And so Amy enjoyed seeing a number of my poems that had some kind of a science connection. And should I do one?
Yeah, but I am not planning to read, because I personally think it's really boring to read from a full-length novel, unless somebody really wants me to. I'm happy to. But poetry is meant to be in oral form.
When I lived and taught here in New Ulm for those 14 years, 1974 to 1988, when I came here, one of the things that most impressed me was the number of bars and taverns in this relatively small town. I spent so much time at the Kaiserhof that when I walked in, Don Weigel used to call it the Meyerhof. And we had a running joke about that. But also, I had friends who had bars. Danny's Bar, Skip's Bar, Shorty's Bar. My friend Tom Ackerson in Goosetown. Sometimes that got to be too much of a good thing. Well, one night, we were with some friends. We were leaving one bar and walking up the street to another. And as we were walking up the sidewalk, a car came racing by. And as it passed us, a teenage voice hollered out the window, "Mr. Meyer sucks," and just kept speeding by. And one of my friends turned to me laughing and said, "Well, Richard, I guess not all of your students think you're so wonderful." To which I said, "Yeah, I suppose you're right." But, I added, notice, he did call me Mr. Meyer.
Richard, we all face that at one time.
Well, I didn't. Some of the poems in this book, these poems cover about 40 years. Many of these poems I wrote while I was in New Ulm. And some of them have undergone revision since then, but many of them go back to my years of living and teaching here. This particular one doesn't, but that event may have been spinning around in my mind when I wrote a poem called Redemption. There are days for all of us, I suppose, when just walking down the street can be an ordeal. And there are days when we all feel kind of insignificant or unimportant in the great scheme of things. And so this poem maybe deals with some of that. It's called Redemption. Both Christian faith and science fact demand a sacrificial act, a forfeit of a cosmic scope that gives us life and grants us hope. To form our elemental stuff, two parents coupling aren't enough. To come to being, we require the selfless deed of something higher. The wondrous matter that we are was forged and shaped inside a star, the crucible for everything. an immolated offering. It was a hefty price to pay, an astral gift from far away. When feeling hopeless, broken down, of no account, a dolt, a clown, a worthless mote, consumed by sin, I flash a self-important grin and look into the nighttime sky. That I might live, a son must die. Which reminds me of Carl Sagan's idea, a comment about the billions and billions of stars, and that we are all star stuff.
Star stuff.
And that's one of the things that I learned in my layman's reading of science that just amazes me, is that, if I remember correctly, I've got someone that can correct me, I think of all the stuff in the universe, 75% of all stuff is hydrogen. About 24% is helium. Everything else, all those other elements on the periodic table, are like less than 2% of matter, the stuff that makes us up. And where did that come from? It only comes from one place. When stars live out their millions and billions of years of life, and they collapse, that enormous pressure of the sun collapsing on itself is what compacts and produces all those other elements on the periodic chart. So, I mean, we literally are star stuff. And suns, S-U-Ns, have to die for us to even be here. And I kind of like those connections between the humanities and sciences when I can find them.
Yeah, it's nice. I like that one. Good stuff.
May I ask?
Sure.
Everybody else should ask too. I don't mean to.
Go right ahead. They can jump in if they want to, yeah.
Okay. So you published a longer book of poetry. Are you writing enough now that there'll be another?
Well, you know, this one took me 40 years, so when people ask, I say, I'll be 105 when the next one comes out. This is something we can maybe talk about, too, is writing habits. I tend to be a kind of sporadic and lethargic writer. And I do think there is, I like writing prose, too. I've never tried my hand at novels. I just like writing, you know, paragraphs and little essays and so on, just for kind of fun. But with poetry, it's as if I have to kind of wait for an inspiration, a line or an idea. And then sometimes I'll just bury myself in it. I mean, for several hours a day after day, for a week or more. Sometimes going on much longer than that, on and off. Working on a single poem or maybe several poems I have going. But then, oh God, I go for weeks, months, and don't write a single thing. I know writers, poets and prose writers, that are so disciplined, they say what you've got to do is sit down at your desk at the same time every day for this block of time, and you sit there until you write so many words or so many pages. Hell, I've never been able to do that. So, and I think it might be a little bit easier to do. When I had to write essays for college classes or such things, then I can plop myself down, and when I'm working with prose, keep urging myself to go on and on. But with poetry, sometimes it just doesn't work that way. The poem that won me the Robert Frost Award, it's a 6-line poem. That poem I wrote, I began writing in the car between New Ulm and Mankato, driving on Highway 68. I used to go back and visit my folks every weekend. I'm from Mankato. And I was driving by Minneopa Park in the spring of the year, and I saw the farmers working in their field, and this line just came to me. I saw all these stones in the ground popping up, you know, from the glacier stones from the spring thaw. And this line just came in my head. The ground is sweating stones. And that line, by the time I got back to Mankato, I had a 4-line poem written. And then I sat down and kept scribbling with it and changing it. And then I put it in my folder called the junk file. Because I thought, well, it was okay, but it's nothing great. That was 36 years ago that I did that poem. I think it was, whatever the math is, it was 1981 or 82. And it was in 2012 when that poem won the Robert Frost Award. But it had undergone changes. It went from a 4-line poem to a 6-line poem, and I think only one line stayed pretty much the same, and even that had some slight word changing. But that was the germination of that, how long it took for that poem to go from its initial writing to the final poem, and then the poem that turned out to win the Robert Frost Award.
So I would recommend that you not try to write a 90,000 word novel. Because it's not going to work out.
Not gonna work
well.
out for me
Yeah, it's not
with my
gonna work
writing
out.
habits.
Yeah. If it's 38 years on 6 lines.
Yeah.
Although it feels like that sometimes.
What's your method, Amy, for writing?
I wish I were the person who, they say, actually the technical term is butt in chair. BIC, that's what you're supposed to do. Butt in chair every day, maybe even a certain time, certain word count, certain amount of time, whatever. No. But if I did, I would be far more prolific. I might be able to do a book a year or even more. But as it is, that is not the way I operate. I do go in spurts, though, when I write. If I get going on a roll, try to do a couple hours a day, every day. And then I'll go weeks, sometimes longer, without anything. And then I've forgotten. I have to go back and write it. Because what happens, I don't know if any of you have ever experimented with writing, because I think it's a pretty common experience among writers, is that you start to hate what you've done. And that becomes actually the biggest incentive to push you away from the project, because you're thinking, oh God, this is terrible. I can't deal with this. I can't keep this up. So fortunately for me, what usually happens is a few weeks later, if I come back and read it fresh, I don't hate it so much anymore. And I think, I can make this work. I can get it where it needs to be.
Do you do a lot of revision, or some writers actually kind of revise as they write? It's kind of both in one. Others will click and clack away and then go back and painstakingly go over the manuscript.
Right, yeah. There are some people who I'm so jealous of these people. There are writers who say, I've got all these characters in my head and they're always talking to me, right? They're talking to me. They're like good people. I'm like, oh my God, nobody's saying anything to me. I'm just like pulling this stuff out of somewhere, trying to get it to happen. So I tend to be pretty methodical. Thriller writers talk about plotters and pantsers. So a plotter is someone who plots out a book ahead of time, knows what the beginning, the middle, and the end is. Sometimes they even do a detailed outline of many, many pages that describes exactly what the book is going to be. And then they go write the book. And then pantsers are writing by the seat of their pants. They just have an idea, like they have a line or a scene, and they just start writing. And I've always assumed that the pantsers write fast, because I'm a plotter, and I definitely write slow. Plotter with a T and a D, I guess. And so I end up not doing as much revision as I think pantsers have to do, because pantsers will sometimes write themselves into a corner, where they'll have something that changes really significantly along the way. They'll discover something and have to make big changes if they go back. Beginnings are hardest for me. I usually have to do my beginnings quite a few times, completely rewrite before I'm satisfied with them. And
Do you have to be completely satisfied with the beginning to go on?
No, because in fact I may be satisfied, but I will go on knowing that I'm probably going to come back, because things sort of reflect on themselves, and especially since character is my weakest point. So usually at the beginning I don't really know how the characters are going to turn out, what their whole arc is going to be throughout the story. And then by the end, of course, I do know, and I can go back and I can make it tie in entirely. And I always think it's nice if somewhere in the beginning you foreshadow something at the end. So I try to you can do that if you go back and change it from the beginning.
There's something that's similar to what you just said with poetry writing too. You mentioned some writers of novels have it all plotted out and even make a detailed outline. Poetry, at least from my experience and many other poets I know, they don't do it that way. You start out and you have no idea where it's going.
Yeah.
I think it was Robert Frost who said a poem begins with delight and ends in wisdom. You start out writing and these lines come and fuss around, but you really don't know what the conclusion is going to be. And as you just mentioned, some novelists will do it that way too. Your character might take you in a direction as you're partway through the novel that you didn't necessarily think of it to begin with.
Yeah, the pantsers argue that the advantage of not plotting is that it keeps the writer interested and therefore wondering what's going to happen next, and therefore it makes the book seem more spontaneous to the reader and more like they want to know what's happening next. And I'm sure that is sometimes true, but there is also going to be many times when that just leads to disaster. You can't just wing everything. Sometimes you got to plan ahead. But I'm a planner in general. It goes with the science, I guess, just kind of organized.
I have a question for you. Are your characters ever based on real people, or are they completely invented from thin air?
Well, nothing is ever completely invented, right? I mean, have I consciously modeled characters on people? Not really. But you show me at least a thriller writer, and probably most others, you show me a thriller writer and let me read their first book, their protagonist is going to be an alter ego of the author in some way, even if they think it's not, and if they didn't want it to be. And it's not always, obvious big things about them, but just the worldview of the protagonist is almost always a reflection, at least somewhat, of the worldview of the author, of the way they see things, the things that they notice, right? I mean, if you have a character who walks into a room and happens to be, the kind of person who notices the carpeting, right? They're into interior decorating or something, and so the character notices the carpeting. Probably that's a writer who has an interest in that as well, because if they didn't, it would never occur to the writer that this might be something that would be a personality trait. I think really good writers are able to imagine so many different characters that they get way beyond that. But certainly in the beginning, I think a lot of thriller writers are writing themselves without meaning to. I, of course, did not. But too embarrassing. It's already embarrassing. I mean, way too much.
Time for another poem, Richard.
Another poem?
Yeah, let's give us one more.
Well, we'll stick with the science-y stuff here. I have a couple very long poems in the book, but most of mine are short lyrics, easily on a single page. This poem is called The Descent of Man, and I snitched the title from Charles Darwin. Of course, most people are familiar with Darwin and his book Origin of Species, in which he set forth and formulated his idea of natural selection. Well, one of his later books was titled The Descent of Man, in which he took these ideas that he had formulated for Origin of Species and applied them to human beings, especially in the area of natural selection. And poets, and I think prose writers too, but especially poets, because we're so compact, we're dealing with a short poem or only so many words and so many lines, we like to play with language and words and ones that have more than one meaning, and try to pack a lot of punch in a single word or a single line. So I like the title The Descent of Man because I think for many readers it might bring up Darwin. But also that word descent, as Darwin uses it, means your ancestry, your heredity, your family line. But then, of course, descent also means to go down, to fall, to collapse. And I think, at least I try in this poem, to use both meanings of that word in this short little poem called The Descent of Man. An ape fell off its family tree, then stood upright on spindly limbs and moved around bipedally, which led to better hands and thumbs and bigger brains and you and me with culture, art, and atom bombs. I like the little punch.
During those 40 years you were writing poetry, were you an avid reader of poetry also?
Yeah. Amy and I were talking too since she came back for a visit about how one gets into writing and why one became a writer. And I don't know if it's not real easy to pinpoint. I kind of have a theory about myself. I come from a big family. I have 7 siblings. My parents, Gert and Andy, we grew up calling them Gert and Andy, were old when they got married. My mom, Gert, was 31, Andy was 40. She had 8 kids in 10 years after that. And so you can imagine what the dinner table was. And I often say I grew up in a house of words because we were always talking and laughing. And my mother loved poetry, and that woman had, and this is not an exaggeration, she had multiple hundreds of lines of poems all memorized. In her day, when she was a young gal back in the 1920s and 30s, daily newspapers used to publish a poem almost every day in the newspaper. Usually a poem by a popular poet, like by Robert Service or some such poet. And she had all these poems memorized. And so I'd hear her recite poetry around the house. And we were always a talking family. And Also, I was a teenager during the era, the dawn of rock and roll. I remember Elvis Presley, but even more than that, the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, and every week there was a new band being made. And I used to like to listen to a lot of rock and roll, and I thought a lot of the lyrics were clever. And actually, what's a good song lyric? A good song lyric is a poem. There are a lot of bad song lyrics, just as there are a lot of bad poems. But and so I think that kind of got me thinking about words and writing too. And then somehow in my late teens, I began just, on my own writing things down. And I knew when I went to college I was going to be an English major. So by that time, then I was taking literature courses and then reading the classic poetry and learning it from the professors. And then that was sort of the final, I think, push that said, I want to do this. But I did it for all those years without really sending anything out until, as I said, just about 6-7 years ago.
Richard, did you ever consider doing an audio reading of your poems? Can you really bring them to life?
Well,
Yes. I hope so.
Amy suggested that early on. I'm like one of those people that thinks I think other people often read my poems better than I do. When you hear yourself recorded on tape, sometimes you sound funny to yourself. I just read something scientifically recently about why that is. It has to do with your
Sound transmission through your skull.
Yeah, your skull's vibrating. Well, I'll tell you what I did. I haven't told anybody this yet. I like action science fiction movies. I'm a big fan of these Marvel comic movies, Iron Man and all those, and the Thor movies. Well, I was on the internet the other day, and or actually a few weeks ago, and you can get a lot of professional actors who have recorded famous poems, Shakespeare's sonnets, or even contemporary poetry. And there's an actor named Tom Hiddleston, which I had never heard of until he's a trained Shakespearean British actor. He played that character Loki in the Thor movies. And young women I ran into, he became the instant overnight heartthrob, this guy. And so I was on the internet, and I came upon him. He had recorded several Shakespeare sonnets and some poems by Andrew Marvell. So, it so happened I have a poem in this book about the god Loki. So I wrote a letter to him. Told him I enjoyed his film work, and that I had come upon him reading these poems on the internet. And I said, I have a book out. I just happened to write a poem that is applicable to your most famous film character. And perhaps you'd like to read it. So I included that in the letter, and then said, wishing you well, so on. So I'm just waiting for him to write back.
Show up on YouTube, read it.
And say, well, Richard, why don't we just record the whole book? and that's a good segue into doing that poem. This poem, if I could lay my hands on it real quickly here.
We're going to get him to do an audio. If not the whole book, at least some of it would be
Here it
really
is.
good.
It's called The Allure of Bad Boys. I think I think all of us, I was about to say anyone who's been a teacher, but anyone who's been in a school, anyone who has been a teacher, it used to amaze me sometimes in my career, and I taught all high school students, and mostly juniors and in fact mostly seniors, and sometimes, once in a while, I'd see this absolutely beautiful young woman, smart as a whip, one of the best human beings that I'd ever encounter. And at the age of 17 or 18, all this ability and talent, and yet she was falling for and traipsing around behind the biggest Neanderthal in school, a real knuckle dragger. And people say, what in the hell does she see in this guy? He would be rude to her and whatnot, but God, she was infatuated with him. The bad boy syndrome. And so, between Loki in the movies, who's a bad boy, this poem is called The Allure of Bad Boys. Loki, Loki, wayward lad, full of mischief, godly bad, two-faced brother, troubled son, lovable chameleon, trickster, charmer, puzzling room, dark as night and bright as moon, working magic, hatching schemes, gorgeous incubus of dreams, soul of ice and heart of fire, darling villain, my desire.
Thank you. Anybody else have any questions about Petroplague or science thriller fiction?
Maybe
Or?
you said something about children's books. Have you written some? Or
I have not, but I published the
published.
digital versions of 2 children's science picture
I thought
books.
you were involved with a project with children in science, or is that
I do a lot of teaching.
teaching?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, I've been involved in something called Nature Bowl in Sacramento, and also some computer programming classes for middle school.
So you haven't terrified them with your microbes yet?
Well, I tried to do some. I actually, I did acquire an incubator on eBay at one point. I think it came from like a vet clinic or something. I cleaned it up, and tried to do a little microbiology at home with my son because he made the mistake of like expressing the slightest passing interest. And I'm like, great, I'm buying an incubator, right? But it was very hard to regulate the temperature, so that didn't go very far.
I'll add that I had the good pleasure of reading the manuscript version of The Han Agent, which is coming out in September.
September 5th.
And I tell you, that first chapter alone. And this is something, too, some novels seem to be written almost as if they're made for the movie, almost like they're a movie script. And I've heard some writers say that. And many books that you read, you can almost picture this as a movie.
Yeah.
I pictured yours as a movie the minute I read it. At first,
The opening is, yeah.
that opening
cinematic.
chapter is just so dramatic and gut-wrenching that, it just sucks you right in.
Yeah.
And it's very, very cinematic and very visual when you do it.
Yeah.
So you want to check that book out when it's out in September.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Will you talk a little bit about how you would go about transferring that to the movies? How would you get discovered?
Yeah, first of all, you need a lot of luck. And then you need a little more luck. But if you want to accelerate that process, as far as I understand, there's a lot of ways that it can happen. If the book is a commercial success, you might be approached by a movie producer. If you have personal contacts in the movie industry, that's probably the best way. And then the other way is to have a literary agent who specializes in, or who has contacts in selling film rights. And some of the big publishers also have dedicated divisions for selling their book rights as films. And there are actually a fair number of thriller writers who do sell film rights, but they very rarely get turned into movies. So it's called getting an option. So you might have a book and a studio, or more commonly now, like an individual movie producer puts together a team, or just themselves buys the option rights, which means that for the next year they have the option to actually start turning it into a movie. And the author gets paid whether it gets made into a movie or not. And then if they decide to actually make it into a movie, then the author gets paid more. And so that's not uncommon, that a well-known thriller book, because a lot of thrillers are cinematic. That's sort of typical of the genre. That they'll get optioned, and they may get optioned repeatedly for years and years, but they never actually turn into movies. But it does obviously happen occasionally.
Would you think of writing a screenplay?
I have no experience with screenplay writing. It's a completely different form on the page. There are certain stylistic rules. I know nothing about it. I would have to learn all of that, and I have no interest in that. I don't think it would play to my strengths. I already think that I had Petroplague was made into an audiobook. I have not done that for reversion, and I haven't decided yet about the Han Agent. Just because my gut feeling is that I actually think my sentences and my words are maybe a little bit too long to do well in an audiobook form. I don't think it flows as an audio as well as it does as a written, but I'm not sure about that. I may have it turned into an audiobook. I mean, personally, I think that if you want to do an audiobook, which is a really good thing with a lot of books, that you should have that in mind as you're writing it, because there's certain ways of expressing things that are more effective in the written form versus in the storytelling out loud form, and it's hard to have the same manuscript do both. Might even make sense to go back and take one of the books and rewrite it specifically with the intention of it being the audio form. Which I
Do you
suppose I
have
can
any
do.
science fiction writers that you're particularly fond
Science fiction and science thrillers, yeah, sort of different categories. I do, but I can never remember these things off the top of my head, right? So the granddaddy of the genre, of course, is Michael Crichton, who's most famous for Jurassic Park, which is, in my opinion, the most perfect science thriller ever written. It is a page-turning masterpiece with real science that you cannot figure out why they don't actually have dinosaurs, right? Why don't we actually have dinosaurs? I used to assign that question to my molecular biology students. Explain to me why we don't actually have dinosaurs from Amber, because it's a really great premise and a really good book. So pretty much anything he ever wrote is good stuff. Probably the next person who's most successful, commercially successful in the genre is James Rollins, who writes the Sigma Force series. Has anybody read James Rollins' Sigma Force? What do you think about James Rollins and Sigma Force? Do you remember?
I just actually read his first book I read by him was Gospel.
Oh, the Blood Gospel series.
Yeah.
Okay, that's
So it's a
completely
whole kind of
separate.
different
Yeah,
from that, but just
and he had a co-writer for that, so he may not have done as much of the writing.
it's a page turner. It was a 600-page book. I read it in like a week because it was, waiting for that next
Right.
thing to happen.
Yeah. So I highly recommend James Rollins. He's got probably close to a dozen of these Sigma Force novels out, and the premise of these are international action-adventure thrillers with a lot of real science that veers off into speculative fiction with crazy, whacked-out science that's pretty obviously not real, but it's good fun, always good fun. And the premise is that there's this secret government agency their offices are located under the Smithsonian Castle in Washington, D.C. It's underground, and it's called the Sigma Force, and Sigma Force is made up of ex-Special Forces people with PhDs. Yeah. And they go around saving the world over and over and over again. So that's
what Jesse Ventura's doing?
Yeah.
I don't think he has a PhD.
Craig was a doctor.
Yeah, what did he have both? I know he was a medical doctor, for sure, yeah. Yeah, he was a genius, just staggering genius. A little more traditional contemporary science fiction, a guy named Mark Alpert, who is he's actually got a physics degree from Princeton, and he writes somewhere between science fiction and science thriller. With like Extinction is one of his more recent books. Mark Alpert's Extinction is it's one of these there's a lot of these artificial intelligence books now. So it's one of these artificial intelligence gone awry things, and the Chinese are the bad guys, and a lot of bad things. A lot of scenes happen in China, and there's a big chase scene in the underground tunnels beneath Beijing, and giant. I think somebody blows up the Three Gorges Dam, and lots of good adventure, action, and science. And then one other that I'll mention that I think is a very interesting book is called The Flicker Men by a guy named Ted Kosmatka. And he hasn't written a lot of books, but this one, the premise was just mind-blowing. It had something to do with what's called the double slit experiment, which is this crazy physics experiment that somehow reveals the nature of the photon is both wave and particle. And this book riffs off of that, and it's something I can't even really explain it, but it reads really well, but that human beings basically fall into two categories. There's people who kind of basically come out one way on the double slit experiment, and then those who come out in the other, and it's creepy and interesting and a very good action story. So those are some that came to mind. Anybody else have something they want to discuss?
Amy, are foreign authors writing in your genre also?
I'm sure they are. Can I name any? Not off the top of my head now. And I can't think of any novels that are in translation in this area. I mean, action thrillers, but in terms of science thrillers, I don't know of any. I'm sure there's some good international science fiction being written.
Amy,
I'm not familiar with that.
Your reviews show up on your website, sciencethrillersmedia.com, right?
ScienceThrillers.com, yes.
Yeah.
Reviews all kinds of science thrillers there. You go
Not only
there.
does she write so well with her novels, but her reviews are worth reading. And I've got, I don't know how many
It's probably 150 there
Yeah.
now. Yeah.
So if you want to get not only an idea of her
Find your
work,
next book.
yeah, but wonderful reviews and ratings for books in the genre.
All kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
Anything with science. I branched out into the reviews a little bit. I do just anything that's got science in it. Just a little bit of nonfiction and lab lit, which is not necessarily thriller fiction and whatnot. So.
Most of your nonfiction, of course, I've written nonfiction, clinical things and all that. Do you ever delve into any nonfiction?
Not book length, but I do some science journalism. I do a monthly column for a local newspaper in Sacramento. It's called Science in the Neighborhood, and every month something vaguely sciencey or engineering related. It's a little bit of a how things work column. So I've done articles about flood control in Sacramento, about what happens after you flush. Where does it go? What engineers do with traffic signals, and then things that are a little bit more sciencey as well. So a little journalism. I have no ambition to write a nonfiction book. I don't have any ideas for that at this time. Anyway. Would you
Well,
like
thank
to
you
do
both
your thing
very
for
much.
giving you a
Oh,
little
thanks. Thank you. Wonderful seeing all of you here. Thanks for coming.
Yes, thank you for being here tonight. We're giving away 2 copies.